in the United States, I mean, Scandinavia has a rich tradition of being paranoid or fearful of alcohol, of drugs, right? Scandinavia, more than almost anywhere, I mean, the Muslims have their own particular issue around alcohol, but the Scandinavians are something special, right? But the United States is even more special in a way because we, went and we prohibited alcohol. We prohibited alcohol. First, a little bit in the 19th century, then we stopped, then we came back in the late 19th century, and the movement to prohibit alcohol, and the notion that if we could prohibit alcohol, the prohibition would result in the abolition of alcohol, would result in, husbands no longer beating their wives and their children, and no more accidents on the roads and the factories, right? We did this. We passed, in all of my country's history, in our 230 or 40-year history, we've only had maybe 2 or 3 dozen amendments to our Constitution, the longest Constitution, oldest Constitution in the world. One of those amendments, the 18th Amendment, was an amendment that had to be supported by 3/4 of the states. We prohibited alcohol. We passed a national amendment to prohibit alcohol. I mean, in retrospect, it seems a ludicrous idea. But we did it. And it was the movement for prohibition tied up with, the women's fight for suffrage, the right to vote. It was tied up with health. It was tied up with World War I and the spirit of self-sacrifice. It was tied up with the sentiment against Germans, the anti-German sentiment, therefore close the breweries in America. I mean, all of these things come together. But this notion of prohibitionism, is deeply in our American psyche. And this belief that one must take one's morals and put one's morals into the criminal law. It is not sufficient only to possess a moral view, you must put it into the criminal law, right? It's the element, it's the kind of theocratic element of the American political psyche, that we need to merge these things. Right? Now, we learned our lesson, 14 years later, in 1933, we passed another national amendment to repeal alcohol prohibition. The only time in American history we have ever passed one amendment to repeal another amendment was with alcohol. Right? So we have a special thing about this. But it's not as if in America we learned our lesson. And to some extent, that deep-seated fear, that passion, that fear of loss of control, that fear of these other things, that it needed to find another target in a respect. And in a way, the other drugs became sort of that new surrogate, that new target. The first director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was created in 1930, his name was Harry Anslinger, and he headed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for over 30 years. His previous job in the late 1920s was to direct the foreign control section of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol Prohibition. Right? So you could see an evolution even in the leadership around this, right? But there was something else. If you ask the question, why in the United States are some drugs criminalized and other drugs treated as a health issue? Keep going. Very good. If you ask that question, right? What you see is it's not grounded in scientific evidence. It's not as if we had a National Academy of Science, which basically assessed the relative dangers of drugs and said, oh, the opiates and cocaine and cannabis here and alcohol and cigarettes here, right? It had to do, as he said, with who used these drugs and who was perceived to use these drugs. In the 1870s, in my country, the principal consumers of opiate drugs were mostly middle-aged women, overwhelmingly women. Not just in my country, others as well, right? And they took a liquid form of opiate, laudanum, and morphine was prevalent, right? There was no penicillin, there was no aspirin, there was no, if a woman was going through her period, what did you take? If you're going through menopause, what did you take? If you lived in a place with bad sanitary conditions, right? Opiates were the panacea, they were the cure-all. They had been, and they grew all around the world. America grew opium, England grew opium like marijuana today, grew everywhere basically, right? And nobody thought about making it illegal. Because nobody thought it was a good idea to throw grandma or auntie in prison. Right? And in fact, many people, many of these women would use it every day, and they did not know they were addicted any more than people know they are addicted to coffee. Right? I mean, who knows they're addicted to coffee? I mean, as long as you have your access every day, you know, I mean, if you think, the way I define addiction, I say my definition of addiction is addiction equals dependence plus problems. Dependence plus problems. You can be dependent on something. You can be dependent on your methadone, or if you're a diabetic, dependent on your insulin, or dependent upon your heart medication, right? But if it's not a problem to get it, if it's not an addiction. You may have a problem with a drug. You don't drink every day, but when you drink too much and do stupid things, but that's not really an addiction either. But if you combine dependence plus problems, that becomes addiction. There are two types of problems, right? One problem is the problem that results from the drug itself. If you are dependent upon alcohol and you consume such large amounts that it destroys your liver and you die at a young age, well, then that becomes something like addiction, right? If this drug, cigarettes, right? You are dependent upon cigarettes, right? And ultimately it kills you from the emphysema, but well, whatever, that we can define as addiction. If you're just dependent upon nicotine, and you have every day of your life you have nicotine gum, nicotine whatever, but that's not a dependence, not an addiction, right? You know. The other type of problem is the problem that can be created by the state. It is not that the drug itself is necessarily so dangerous. It is that the behavior of the state, or potentially the norms of the society, but especially the action of the state, problematizes the drug dependence, thereby making this addiction, transforming what would normally be a dependence, mostly non-harmful to the user and community, into an addiction which creates harms for the user and also for the society. That especially we know is the situation with opiates, but is also with many other prohibited substances. Right? Those women in the 1870s were dependent, but there was no, and they didn't even know. I mean, there was a period during the Civil War when there was a reduction in the supply of opium, and then people would start to all of a sudden not have their daily, and then they began to have their shakes and shivers and fever, and they realized maybe, with coffee, or who knows, they're addicted. I mean, I'm Jewish. Once a year, on our most sacred holiday, Yom Kippur, I fast. I eat no food, no water for 25, 26 hours. And that many Jews do this. We fast this one day. In the middle of the day, many Jews get splitting headaches. They think God is punishing them. It's not. It's the withdrawal symptoms from the coffee, right? I mean, so it's in that sense that we learn about the nature of this stuff. Now, when in the late 1870s and 1880s, many Chinese people began to come to the United States to work on the railroads and in the mines, and when there was the fear of these yellow people, bringing their tradition, and they would work 70, 80, 90 hours a week, and they'd go back home to their camps, their dorms, their building, and they would smoke their opium pipe to relax for their aches and pains, just as they did in the old country, and just as many white people would do with their alcohol. But then there was the fear and the opium dens, and the fear of what would these these Chinamen do with their opium pipes, addicting and seducing our white women into lie. And this was the journalism. And the first drug prohibition laws in my country were directed in Nevada and in California, directed to Chinese minorities. The first cocaine prohibition laws were in the beginning of the 20th century in the South, directed at black men. Black men taking cocaine, the fear about these black men taking this white powder up their black noses, and who knows what they would do, forgetting their proper place in American society in the South, all of the fears. And not just the sort of tabloid journalism. But the New York Times, our most prestigious paper, reporting in ways that seem preposterous today. But those were the first prohibition laws. With marijuana, cannabis, the first cannabis prohibition laws were in the teens and the 20s in the Midwest and Southwest of the United States, directed at Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants, right? Coming, taking the good jobs from the good white people, go home, smoke up their little funny smelling reefer cigarettes, right? And once again the fear, what would these darker skinned people do, with this power and with our children and our women, all always connected to the fear around women and children, right? Even the struggle over alcohol prohibition in my country was to some extent a struggle, really of a similar sort. It was between the white Americans and the not so white Americans, right? Between the white Americans coming from Northern Europe in the 18th and first half of the 19th century, and the not so white Americans coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century with their beer and their vino and their schlivovitz, right? I mean, it was this hordes of people, and all of the fears we had around, you see it in America now, with the concerns about immigration from Latin America, the same fears. And in a way, it's not that the white Americans drank that much less than the not so white Americans, but there was also an understanding that when you criminalize something that is still going to be engaged in by huge numbers of people, so that the power of law enforcement, its discretionary power to enforce these laws is massive. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. Well, where is the police going to focus their resources? They're not going to be going to the social clubs of powerful men. They're going to be going to the social clubs of darker-skinned, poorer people. That's the way it's going to be. It's always been very difficult. The African-American leadership, because it's been so grounded in the church, and with such a high level of moralism, incredibly moralistic, so they would share this sensibility that alcohol is terrible, these other things are sinful, therefore we must make them illegal. But the absence of forethought that if you make this sin into a criminal law, the principal targets of the new law and the new law enforcement will be your own people, your own black people. I mean, it's been, that's been one of the problematic dimensions in the failure of black leadership in America until recently to change this.